Oxford movements. Christianity was booming in America. Back in Blighty, though, some people thought that the church was in a bad way. In 1833, John Keble, an Oxford academic, preached a sermon accusing Britain of becoming an ex-Christian nation. He was worried that the church had gone too far in the direction of Wesley and all those nonconformist bods. What he wanted was more bishops, a stronger, more authoritarian church hierarchy, and the return of the doctrine of transubstantiation. Catholicism, in other words. He and his friend Newman wrote a series of tracts, culminating in 1841 with the imaginatively titled Tract 90, a piece of revisionist theology which argued that the 39 Articles of the Church of England were in fact perfectly in agreement with the Roman Catholic Council of Trent. It was all a dream. It was known as the Oxford movement. The other name was Tractarianism, from all those tracts they kept pushing out. Inevitably, a lot of other Anglicans disagreed. So, in 1845, Newman, along with a few hundred of his followers, packed his chasuble, left the Church of England, and joined the Catholics. But others who thought similarly stayed within Anglicanism, where they established the Anglo-Catholic Party, which was quite like the Protestant Party, except you got to wear nicer frocks. Tractarians were big in leafy Oxford, but not so much in grimy Oldham. In northern Britain, the Industrial Revolution was now in full swing. Britain was the world leader in manufacturing, not to mention its status as a world leader in industrialised misery, slum landlords, and rickets. Or should that be rackets? Critical Germans and depressed Danes. In 1835, a German theologian called D.F. Strauss published The Life of Jesus. The book argued that the gospel stories were not lies in the sense that Reimarus has stated, but were myths, that is, fictions that in a symbolic way speak of the true meaning of Jesus. They were not historical facts, but reworkings of Old Testament stories to show how he fulfilled the Jewish hopes. Strauss had studied at Tübingen University, where his professor, F.C. Bauer, was also looking hypercritically at the gospel accounts. He came from a different direction. Noting the argument in the early church between Paul and Peter, he deduced that these must be representative of two opposing factions within the early church, the Jewish and the Gentile groupings. And more, since only 4 of Paul's letters mention the argument, he concluded that the rest were forgeries. It's not a theory that is taken seriously today, and it falls down on a number of points, such as there not being a shred of proof for any of it, but what it did was kick off a way of looking at the New Testament that is still prevalent today. Other scholars brought a much more hands-on approach to their research. Konstantin von Tischendorf, 1815-74, was the Indiana Jones of Bible manuscript studies. Having published a new edition of the Greek New Testament, when he was just 27, he then deciphered the previously impenetrable manuscript Codex Ephraimi, using nothing but his naked eyes. He was acclaimed as the world's greatest paleographer. Then in 1844, he went on a hunt for rare manuscripts to the remote monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. Inside, he found a time capsule, a living relic of Byzantine monastic practices from the time of Justinian. There were 22 chapels, there were Byzantine mosaics, there was a mausoleum guided by the Stephanos, the monastery caretaker. Rather inconveniently, he had died some 1,100 years before, but they left his skeleton in place. After all, he had never actually resigned. And he found what turned out to be the world's oldest complete manuscript of the Bible. It took many years, several visits, and heavyweight backing from the Tsar to persuade the monks to part with it. And to this day, there are still arguments over whether Tischendorf borrowed or purchased it. But Codex Sinaiticus, written between 325 and 360, has proved to be one of the most valuable manuscripts for establishing the original text of the Greek New Testament. The Bolsheviks sold it in 1917, and today it is in the British Museum. Well, most of it. Some bits are still in Sinai and elsewhere, but you can view the complete version online. The American explorer Edward Robinson travelled throughout Palestine, mapping hundreds of ancient biblical sites, as well as discovering the remains of Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem. In 1868, a German missionary discovered the Moabite stone, a monument carved with the oldest Hebrew script known, commemorating the defeat of Israel by Mesha, king of Moab. In Mesopotamia, thousands of cuneiform tablets were discovered in the abandoned libraries of long-forgotten emperors, and 2 British archaeologists, Grenfell and Hunt, found a treasure trove of papyrus fragments, wills, receipts, letters, accounts, the kind of writing that opened up the world of ordinary Greek-speaking people from the time of the New Testament. Meanwhile, in Denmark, Søren Kierkegaard, 1813 to 55, was very gloomy. Lots of people are, and always have been gloomy in Denmark. It's that kind of place. But Søren took gloominess to a whole new level. He was particularly upset about the way that the liberal, complacent Christianity had taken all the really serious stuff out: sin and salvation and the fear of God. He was sick of this abstract thinking and sick of everyone demanding evidence. Humans had to be weaned from their insistence on visible evidence. Instead, it was all about the faith of the individual. Science and scholarship want to teach that becoming objective is the way. Christianity teaches that the way is to become subjective, to become a subject. All this stuff about what is objectively true or what is rational is mere footling. In his journal, he wrote that the thing is to understand myself, to see what God really wishes me to do. The thing is to find a truth which is true for me, to find the idea for which I can live and die. Had he been French and born 100 years later, he would have sat in cafes, smoking Gauloise and wearing black polo neck jumpers and shrugging a lot. But as it was, he was Danish, so he was just assumed to be a bit bonkers. And he died without anyone realising that he'd invented existentialism. Exterminate all the brutes. Britain had lost America, but elsewhere it was business as usual. And business was the word. The empire was driven by commercial interests and huge companies like the East India Company in Asia or the Van Diemen's Land Company in Tasmania. Some missionary work brought the missionaries into conflict with these interests. The famous explorer David Livingstone, 1813 to 73, was sponsored by the London Missionary Society. He was a tireless advocate for the rights of the African natives, a message that did not go down well with the commercial and state interests that were seeking to exploit these huge new territories. The Far East was opening up as well. Another London Missionary Society worker was Robert Morrison, 1782 to 1834, a Scottish Presbyterian who was sent to China by the London Missionary Society in 1807. Like Carey, he was not welcomed by the British East India Company, nor indeed by Imperial China. It was hard work. It took him 7 years before he reported a single baptism. 50 years later, Japan was prized open. The country had been closed to foreigners for 200 years. In 1857, America used its powers of persuasion, an enormous gunboat parked in the harbour, to persuade the country to open up to foreign trade. And when French missionaries managed to enter the country, they discovered that there was still a church there. The Catholics who had gone underground 2 centuries before had survived in hidden churches dating back to the time of Francis Xavier. The French missionaries immediately pointed out to these plucky survivors everything that they were doing wrong, thus splitting the church straight away. Not only that, but the Japanese suddenly became aware of the Christians' presence and exiled some 40,000 of them, thus making this the least successful missionary visit ever. Africa had been parcelled up between the European nations, and the missionaries usually arrived on the same ships as the colonial administrators and the merchants. Some of them became little more than chaplains to the imperialist forces, the 19th century Protestant equivalents of the Catholic priests in Spanish and Portuguese South America. It was not that they weren't sincere. They believed utterly that they were saving souls, nor was it that they did not bring benefits to the regions they served. There are plenty of examples then, as now, of hospitals and schools being built. But the issue often was that for them, the ascendancy of spiritual concerns obscured their vision on worldly issues, that spreading the good news in the colonies required turning a blind eye to the activities of the colonial powers. Every colonial power has its skeletons in the cupboard. When Britain colonised Australia, the Van Diemen's Land Company took over the running of Tasmania. Many of the natives were slaughtered. By 1820, the local press of the settlers was demanding that the natives should be relocated. If they refused, they should be hunted down like wild beasts and destroyed. In 1829, the government let loose British prisoners to hunt down natives and bring them into an assembly camp. It is estimated that for every native who made it to the camp, 9 were killed out in the bush. By 1830, there were only 300 Tasmanians left. Perhaps the most notorious cases of cruelty come from the rule of King Leopold II, 1835 to 1909, of Belgium. The Congo was Leopold's personal possession, and his agents exploited the rubber tree plantations with a brutal aggression. If African workers on the plantation didn't work hard enough, they could have their right hand and forearm cut off. Belgians in the Congo killed millions of Africans. Back in Europe, people heard rumours of this cruelty, of course, and tried to raise the issues, but Africa was a long way away. And anyway, these peoples were inferior races. Science had proved it. Planet of the Apes. In December 1831, a young amateur naturalist went on a journey. Before the voyage, he was supposed to have been embarking on a career in the church. Instead, he embarked on a boat called the Beagle and went to the Galapagos Islands. And when he returned, with notebooks stuffed with drawings and a head stuffed with ideas, he had invented evolution. Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, returned from the Galapagos Islands in 1836, but it wasn't until 1859 that he published his landmark book, On the Origin of Species. In between the two events, there have been other notable scientific discoveries that had rocked the Christian world. The discovery of fossils, for example, put a serious crimp in the whole "the universe was created in 6 days" theory. But it was On the Origin of Species that really put the cat among the finches. Darwin showed how finches on different islands were almost but not quite the same as each other, and that they had adapted to their various environments. From that he developed the idea of survival of the fittest. Animals were not, in his theory, created as one-offs by God. They adapted, mutated, and changed through natural selection. He followed this up with The Descent of Man, in which he put forward the idea of evolution. Humanity had evolved from the apes. It was, on the face of it, a massive challenge to the traditional doctrines of the Church. If there were no Adam and Eve, then what did that make of Genesis? And what happens to doctrines such as the creation of the universe and the fall of humans? Many Christians simply embraced the theory. They saw God at work through evolution. Genesis was a story that told a deep truth, but it was not a scientific thesis. Others, however, reacted more angrily. There was a famous debate between Bishop Samuel Wilberforce and the Darwinist Thomas Huxley, 1825 to 95. Darwin didn't want to take part. Huxley wrote that the historical trustworthiness of the Jewish scriptures meant that the foundations of Christianity were built upon legendary quicksands. The debate itself was not quite the knockdown victory as often portrayed to be. Darwin himself thought that Wilberforce's scientific counter-arguments uncommonly clever, but it did give the impression of a church that hadn't quite grasped the issues and was on the defensive. In 1869, Huxley, who possessed some of the finest sideburns ever seen, coined a word to describe his own faith, or lack of it: agnosticism. It was not an outright disbelief, just an intellectual shrug, a not knowing. The church went on the defensive. It began to retrench, to batten down the hatches. It not only affirmed the Bible as inerrant, it set its dogma in stone as well. It was at the First Vatican Council of 1870, for example, that the doctrine of papal infallibility was formally defined. And Darwinism had its dark side, in the sense that it became possible to talk quite openly about lesser species. Darwin himself had seen that in action. On his return journey, he had stopped in Tasmania and seen what his countrymen had done to the natives. By the time On the Origin of Species was published, there were only 9 Tasmanian women left, all of them too old to bear children. Survival of the fittest led to extinction, and if some tribes, some peoples are being wiped out, well, what can we say? It's a jungle out there.